You know, those big financial moments in life, maybe you're trying to buy your first home or figure out retirement, or maybe it's even just picking a credit card from, well, way too many options. Do you ever get that feeling like you're lost? Like you're trying to navigate this incredibly complex map, but you don't have a compass, just adrift in all the financial terms and choices. Well, today we're doing a deep dive into something absolutely essential for finding your way, financial literacy. And it's so much more than just knowing about money. It's really about having the core knowledge and the actual skills to make genuinely informed decisions in a financial world that just seems to get way more complicated every single day.
Absolutely. And our guide for this deep dive today is a really foundational piece of research. It's called The Economic Importance of Financial Literacy, Theory and Evidence. It was written by two leading economists, Lusardi and Olivia S. Mitchell, and published back in 2014 in the Journal of Economic Literature. It's a landmark paper. It gives this incredibly comprehensive look at the huge amount of economic research that's been growing around financial literacy. They pull together insights from economic theory, loads of recent surveys, and real world evidence from the US and frankly all over the globe. It gives us a really complete picture.
Right. So our mission today is to unpack what financial literacy really means, for you, the listener. We want to find out how much people actually know, or maybe more accurately, don't know about managing their finances. We'll dig into the huge impact this knowledge or the lack of it has on our economic well-being, often in ways we don't even realize. And crucially, we'll explore what actually works to bridge these knowledge gaps. You should walk away with some, I think, genuinely surprising insights and a much clearer understanding of why this topic is just so critical for everyone. Okay, so let's set the scene a bit. Over the last few decades, things have changed dramatically in the financial world. I mean, products and services that maybe used to be for experts are now, available to pretty much anyone, right? Even the so-called small investor. What's really driven this huge shift, and how has it changed the game for individuals, for people like you and me?
Yeah, it's a really fascinating transformation, isn't it? If you look back maybe, 30, 40 years, financial products were, simpler. And a lot of the heavy lifting, let's say, was done by institutions, by companies, or the government. But today, wow, we've seen just an absolute explosion of really complex products. Think about credit cards, right? With all their different interest rates and fees, mortgages, including those subprime ones that, we all know played a huge role in the 2008 crisis, student loans, obviously, and definitely how we save for retirement has changed completely with all these different pension accounts and annuities. The paper points out that before that 2008 crisis, consumer credit and mortgage borrowing had just, they use the word burgeoned. It had exploded. People were making these massive borrowing decisions directly, which was, historically speaking, pretty unusual.
Right. So it used to be that a lot of that responsibility, especially for something big like retirement, was handled for you by your employer, maybe, or the government. The institution kind of shouldered the risk.
Exactly. That's precisely it. Think about maybe your parents' or grandparents' generation. They mostly relied on things like Social Security and what we call defined benefit, or DB pension plans. Those are the plans where your employer basically promised you a set, predictable income in retirement. They took on the investment risk themselves. But now it's a totally different world.
A stark contrast, you said.
Yeah. Today's baby boomers, for instance, they mostly have defined contribution, or DC, plans saying 401ks and IRAs. This huge shift, economists sometimes call it disintermediation. Basically, financial institutions are stepping back a bit from that direct management. And what that means is that individuals, you're increasingly responsible for your own financial future.
So it's not just deciding how much to save anymore.
No, not at all.
Yeah.
It's how much to save, where to invest it, which is complex enough, and then critically figuring how to actually spend down that wealth in retirement without, running out of money. This whole process of spending down assets, economists call it decumulation. It's a really tricky thing to manage.
That's a huge mental load for people. I mean, you have to manage your assets carefully so you don't outlive them. It puts so much more responsibility onto households, borrowing, saving, investing, that whole decumulation piece. So given this massive shift, what is financial literacy in this new reality? How do we even define it?
It's absolutely foundational. The paper defines financial literacy as people's ability to process economic information and make informed decisions about financial planning, wealth accumulation, debt, and pensions. Pretty straightforward, right?
Yeah.
But here's where it gets really interesting from a theoretical angle. Research actually views financial knowledge as a specific form of investment in human capital.
Ah, so like learning a trade or getting a degree, it's not just good to know, it's actually an investment in yourself that can pay off financially.
Yeah, exactly. Think about it. Investing time and effort in education or job skills can lead to better jobs, higher pay. Similarly, investing your time and maybe even some money into building your financial know-how can genuinely help you, as the paper puts it, earn above average expected returns on your money. It's like building your own personal toolkit for navigating the financial world. And this idea, they call it endogenizing financial knowledge, meaning it's a choice you make to learn this stuff, like any other investment. Well, that has really big implications.
How so?
Well, first, it directly impacts your own well-being, right? If
Oh.
you choose to become more financially literate, you're just statistically more likely to make smarter choices. That's huge for you personally. But it also gives us crucial clues about what kinds of policies might actually work to boost financial knowledge across the whole population. You see, standard economic models often just assume everyone is perfectly rational, totally informed, capable of doing complex math in their heads.
Which we know isn't really true for most people.
Exactly. This paper really highlights those huge gaps between modeling and reality. It shows most people just don't have that assumed level of expertise.
That's a critical insight. It's not just what you know, but the active decision to learn it. And I guess learning this stuff takes time, maybe even money for courses or books. It's a real investment decision.
It absolutely is. Just think about the time it takes to research the best savings account options, or to really understand the fine print on a mortgage, or compare different investment funds. That time is a genuine cost. And understanding this helps explain why some people might, quite rationally perhaps, choose not to invest heavily in becoming financial experts. For example, the research actually suggests that if someone expects to have a really strong safety net in old age, like generous government benefits, they might optimally choose to have low financial literacy.
Because their basic needs are already covered.
Exactly. Their consumption is sort of insured by those transfer programs, so the marginal benefit of learning complex finance might seem low to them. However, and this is really powerful, the model also predicts a significant upside. Even if someone with, say, limited education, gains some financial knowledge early on, maybe in high school, and then never makes another active investment decision, just lets that knowledge naturally fade over time, they will still earn higher returns on whatever savings they do have. This generates a massive welfare boost, as they call it.
Wow. Can you give an example of that?
Yeah, the estimates are pretty staggering. Providing some basic pre-labor market financial knowledge to the least educated group could improve their overall well-being by an amount equivalent to, get this, 82% of their initial wealth.
82%. Just from some early knowledge.
Incredible, right? And even for college graduates, the estimate is still huge, around 56%. It really drives home that getting that financial knowledge early on can benefit people dramatically, even if they don't become, Wall Street traders later.
Yeah.
It just sets them on a much better path from the start.
That's amazing. It's not just a skill. It's like a financial superpower you get early on. It really makes you think about the impact of education. But okay, financial literacy still sounds pretty broad. How do researchers actually measure it? How do they put a number on whether someone gets it or not?
That's a really key challenge. Lusardi and Mitchell tackled this head-on back in 2008. They designed a standard set of questions based on 4 clear principles. First was simplicity. The questions had to tap into the absolute fundamental building blocks needed for making decisions over time, nothing too obscure. Second, relevance. They needed to connect to concepts people actually encounter in their day-to-day financial lives. General ideas, not niche stuff. Third, brevity. Keep the number of questions short, really short, so they could actually be included in big, broad surveys without taking up too much time. And fourth, capacity to differentiate. The questions had to be good enough to actually tell the difference between someone who knows very little and someone who has a decent grasp. They needed to sort people effectively.
Okay, so simple, relevant, brief, and able to differentiate. What were these core building blocks that passed those tests?
They zeroed in on 3 fundamental concepts that really underpin most financial decisions. The first one is basically compound interest and numeracy. The standard question goes something like this. Suppose you had $100 in a savings account and the interest rate was 2% per year. After 5 years, how much do you think you would have?
And the options are like more than $102, exactly $102 or less.
Precisely. Along with don't know or refuse, It tests basic math skills, but also, crucially, whether you understand that interest earns interest, that money grows on itself over time.
Got it. So understanding that $100 at 2% for 5 years isn't just $100 plus 5 times $2, because the interest starts earning interest too. What's the second concept?
The second is inflation. The question is something like, imagine the interest rate on your savings account was 1% per year and inflation was 2% per year. After 1 year, would you be able to buy more than, exactly the same as, or less than today with the money in this account? End quote. This gets at whether you understand that inflation eats away at your purchasing power. Even if your money is earning some interest, if inflation is higher, you can actually buy less over time. It's about understanding the real value, not just the nominal amount.
Makes sense. And the third one?
The third core concept is risk diversification. The typical question asks if this statement is true or false. Buying a single company stock usually provides a safer return than a stock mutual fund.
Okay, so this tests if you know what stocks and mutual funds are, basically, and the whole don't put all your eggs in one basket idea.
Exactly. A mutual fund holds lots of different stocks, so it generally spreads out the risk compared to betting everything on just one company. These three questions are so critical because so many big decisions, especially around retirement savings and investing, involve financial markets. Grasping these basics is just essential. Now, of course, any set of questions is just a proxy, right? It's not a perfect measure of someone's true, deep financial knowledge. There's always some measurement error. But these three have proven incredibly robust and useful across many studies.
All right, so armed with these foundational, maybe deceptively simple questions, what did researchers actually find when they went out and asked people, particularly here in the United States? Were people generally knowledgeable?
Well, the findings were pretty eye-opening and, frankly, a bit depressing for many. These three questions were first used in a big, nationally representative survey of Americans aged 50 and older, the Health and Retirement Study, or HRS, back in 2004. And the results from that survey, they basically indicated that this older U.S. population was largely financially illiterate. Only about half of them could correctly answer that simple 2% compound interest calculation. And only about half knew how inflation impacts purchasing power.
Only half. On those basic concepts.
Only half. And here's the real shocker. Only 1/3, just about 33%, could answer all three questions correctly.
Wow. For people aged 50 plus who've likely been making financial decisions for decades, that's really stark. What about the risk question? Was that particularly tricky?
Yes. That risk diversification question was where people really stumbled. A huge percentage, almost 34% in that 2004 survey, just answered, do not know. That really points to a widespread lack of understanding about fundamental investment principles. And it wasn't just that one survey. Similar patterns popped up again and again in other major U.S. surveys, like the National Longitudinal Survey of Youth, looking at younger adults, and the big National Financial Capability Study. It consistently shows that financial literacy levels are, well, generally pretty low across the board, across different age groups in the U.S.
Okay, so the basics are shaky. Are these knowledge gaps just limited to those core three ideas, or do they get worse when you ask about slightly more complex financial topics?
Oh, the gaps definitely widen. When surveys started including questions about more advanced concepts, the lack of knowledge became even more apparent. For example, data from the 2009 National Financial Capability Study showed that only about 21% of Americans understood the basic inverse relationship between bond prices and interest rates.
Which is pretty fundamental if you're investing in bonds.
Absolutely. And then there's debt literacy, which is just so vital for managing borrowing. The surveys found only about 1/3 of people could correctly figure out how long it would take for a debt to double if it was compounding at a 20% interest rate.
Think about credit card debt. That's incredibly relevant.
Exactly. It's directly relevant to millions of people's daily lives. And studies consistently show that even high school and college students in the U.S. generally get failing financial literacy grades. So unfortunately, these knowledge gaps seem to start early and just stick around into adulthood.
So stepping back, connecting this to the bigger picture, is this low level of understanding mainly a U.S. issue? Or are we seeing this lack of financial literacy across the globe?
Oh, it's definitely not just a U.S. problem, not at all. Low financial literacy is, well, it's pervasive worldwide. You see it even in countries with highly developed financial markets. Places like Germany, the Netherlands, Sweden, Italy, Japan. And you also see it, perhaps unsurprisingly, in economies that are changing rapidly, like Russia and Romania. Across almost all countries surveyed, very few people can consistently answer those three basic financial literacy questions correctly. That 30% figure in the U.S. who got all three right. You see similarly low percentages in many other sophisticated markets.
That's fascinating. Are there interesting differences between countries, though, maybe based on their history or culture? Does a country's economic past shape how people understand finance today?
Yes, absolutely. You can definitely see how national historical experience shapes what adults know. For example, people in Germany and the Netherlands. They're generally more likely to understand the inflation question correctly.
Which makes sense given their history with hyperinflation, right?
Yeah, exactly. It's baked into their collective memory, you could say. But contrast that with Japan, where far fewer people understood the inflation question. And that likely reflects Japan's long experience with the opposite problem, deflation. Similarly, in countries that used to have centrally planned economies, like Romania and Russia, people showed the lowest levels of understanding about inflation. They just haven't had decades of personal experience navigating market-driven price changes in the same way. It really shows how lived economic history shapes financial understanding.
Very interesting. And what about that risk diversification question internationally? Is that still the big stumbling block everywhere?
Yes, pretty much universally. Across almost every country they looked at, risk diversification seems to be the concept that people find hardest to grasp. You see consistently high rates of people just saying, do not know to that question. Like 34% in the US, 32% in Germany, 33% in the Netherlands. Even in places often thought of as quite financially savvy, like Sweden or Switzerland, you still had significant percentages, like 18% or 13%, saying they didn't know the answer. It really suggests a global challenge in understanding basic investment risk. And major international organizations like the OECD, the Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development, they've really highlighted this. They even added a financial literacy section to their big PISA assessment back in 2012, the one that compares 15-year-olds globally. They recognize financial literacy now as an essential skill for participation in today's economy.
It truly is a universal issue. But here's something that really intrigues me. Given how consistently low these scores are, how do people think they're doing? Do people realize they have these knowledge gaps, or is there a disconnect between reality and perception?
Well, that's where it gets quite concerning. There is, unfortunately, often a substantial mismatch, as the paper calls it, between people's self-assessed knowledge, how smart they think they are about money, and their actual objective knowledge measured by these questions.
So overconfidence is a big problem.
A huge problem. For instance, in that 2009 U.S. financial capability study, 70% of people rated their own financial knowledge as a 4 or higher on a 7-point scale. So mostly positive. But remember, only 30% of that same group could actually answer the basic factual questions correctly.
Wow, 70% think they're doing okay, but only 30% actually are.
Exactly. And you see very similar patterns of overconfidence in places like Germany and the Netherlands. Most people genuinely believe they have a decent handle on things, even when the objective data tells a very different story.
It really makes you think about all those times you've probably just nodded along in a meeting or talking to a financial advisor, maybe pretending to understand, when deep down you were completely lost.
Precisely. Now, one interesting exception the paper notes is Japan. Respondents there actually gave themselves low grades in financial knowledge, which suggests maybe a higher degree of self-awareness about their limitations. But generally, this widespread overestimation of knowledge has a really serious and frankly quite tragic implication. It helps explain why financial scams are often perpetrated against the elderly.
Because they might be less knowledgeable, but more confident.
Exactly. Research shows that while actual financial literacy often declines with age, older individuals tend to show increasing confidence in their financial decision-making abilities. That combination makes them particularly vulnerable targets for fraudsters.
That's a critical point for understanding vulnerability. Okay, what about the questions themselves? Can just changing the wording slightly affect how people answer and maybe even skew our measurement of literacy?
Yes, this is a subtle but really important methodological point. Question wording can significantly influence responses. It suggests that our measures of financial literacy, while useful, can sometimes be what researchers call noisy proxies of true knowledge, meaning they don't perfectly capture what someone knows, and there's some randomness or confusion influencing the answers. They actually tested this specifically with the risk diversification question. They randomly showed people one of two versions. Format A was the one we discussed. Buying a company's stock usually provides a safer return than a stock mutual fund. True or false? Format B flipped it around. Buying a stock mutual fund usually provides a safer return than a company's stock. True or false? Logically, they're asking the same thing.
So just flipping the statement, what happened?
Well, they found that responses were definitely sensitive to how the question was worded. This showed up in surveys in both the US and the Netherlands. In the Dutch survey, for instance, fewer people answered correctly when they saw Format B, the one stating the mutual fund is safer.
Why would that be?
Well, perhaps because the correct answer in Format B is true, and maybe saying true to something involving stock market investing just felt intuitively riskier or less certain to people. Whereas with Format A, the correct answer is false, which might align better with the general sense of caution about single stocks. Conversely, the percentage of correct responses actually doubled in one sample when people saw Format A compared to Format B. This wasn't just people guessing randomly. It strongly suggested that some respondents didn't fully grasp the underlying concepts. Maybe they weren't clear on what stocks or mutual funds even were. So some answers that looked correct might have just been lucky guesses or driven by confusion due to the wording. It really underscores how tricky it is to truly measure financial knowledge accurately and why careful survey design is so important.
Okay, so now we have a clearer picture of how financial literacy is measured and these widespread, often quite surprising knowledge gaps. Let's dive deeper into who is most affected. Are there clear patterns? Is it just random, or are certain groups more likely to have lower financial literacy?
That's a great question. And yes, there are absolutely definite patterns. The theoretical framework we talked about earlier, viewing financial knowledge as human capital, actually predicts what's called a hump-shaped life cycle profile for financial literacy.
A hump shape, meaning?
Meaning it tends to be lowest among the young, then it increases and peaks somewhere in middle age, and then it tends to decline again among the elderly, like a bell curve across your lifespan. And guess what? The survey data consistently confirms this pattern in numerous countries.
So young people starting out and older adults in retirement tend to be the least knowledgeable. Why do we see that decline later in life? Is it just forgetting things?
It's a bit tricky to perfectly separate the effects of aging itself from, say, generational differences. Maybe older generations just had less exposure to financial education. But using statistical models, researchers consistently find that actual financial literacy scores do tend to fall with age. And what's particularly concerning, as we touched on, is that older people often overestimate their financial literacy, even as their objective scores decline. Researchers like Fink, Howe, and Houston confirm this. As actual financial literacy drops with age, people's confidence in their financial decision-making often increases.
That sounds like a dangerous combination.
It really is. That significant mismatch between what people think they know and what they actually know helps explain why, as we discussed, older adults are often targeted by financial scams. They might be less savvy, but more confident, making them vulnerable.
That's incredibly important for understanding where support might be needed most. What about differences between men and women? Is gender a significant factor in financial literacy levels?
Yes, absolutely. One of the most striking and consistent findings in all the empirical data is the large and persistent gender difference. Across the board, in study after study, men generally score higher on financial literacy questions than women. This pattern holds true across different age groups and across almost all countries where it's been measured. This is a really robust finding. However, there's a crucial nuance here.
Okay, what's the nuance?
While women are less likely to answer the questions correctly, they are far more likely to say they do not know an answer. This tendency for women to acknowledge their uncertainty is also incredibly consistent across countries: the US, Germany, Japan, Italy, you name it.
So women are often more aware of what they don't know, which in a way could actually be seen as an advantage, right? That self-awareness might make them more open to learning.
Exactly. That's a key insight. This awareness of their own lack of knowledge may make women ideal targets for financial education programs because they might be more receptive to filling those self-perceived gaps. Now, why these gender differences exist is complex. Some theories suggest it relates to specialization of labor within the household, where historically, maybe one spouse, often the man, took the lead on finances. But that doesn't fully explain why single women or even girls in high school also tend to score lower. Other research points to potential differences in how women acquire or produce financial literacy, or maybe differences in self-confidence related to finance. What's really telling is that even highly educated women's studies looked at alumni from very selective colleges still showed relatively low financial literacy. This indicates that just having a good general education doesn't automatically translate into financial savvy for everyone, particularly women.
Okay, so beyond age and gender, what about formal education? We touched on it briefly, but is there a strong link? And is higher financial literacy just a sign of being generally smarter, or is it really a distinct skill set?
There is definitely a very strong positive correlation between years of formal education and financial literacy. People without a college degree are consistently found to be much less likely to be knowledgeable about these basic financial concepts. This holds true across U.S. surveys and internationally. And numeracy basic math skills, which are crucial for finance, is particularly poor among those with lower levels of education. So yes, more schooling generally correlates with higher financial knowledge.
But is it just about general intelligence or cognitive ability?
That's the key question researchers dug into. They looked at whether financial literacy was simply a proxy for overall cognitive ability, using measures like scores from the Armed Services Vocational Aptitude Battery Test. And while cognitive ability is certainly positively correlated with financial literacy, smarter people tend to know more about finance. Unsurprisingly, the studies found that cognitive ability did not fully account for the variance, meaning even after you control for differences in general intelligence, significant differences in financial literacy still remain. This strongly suggests that financial literacy is, in fact, a distinct skill set. It's not just about being generally smart, it's about having specific knowledge relevant to the financial domain. Think of it as specialized knowledge, like knowing medical terminology if you're a doctor.
Got it. Are there any other clear patterns? What about things like income level, race, or even where people live? Does geography matter?
Yes. The research identifies quite a few other regularities. Financial savvy varies quite a bit by income and employment status. Lower paid workers and unemployed individuals consistently score worse. In the U.S., studies consistently find marked differences by race and ethnicity. African Americans and Hispanics generally display the lowest levels of financial knowledge, and this pattern holds across different age groups and using various literacy measures.
And geography. Does living in a city versus the countryside make a difference?
It seems to do so, yes. People living in rural areas generally score lower on financial literacy tests than their urban counterparts. And there are even noticeable regional differences within countries. They found this in Italy, Romania, and even across different U.S. states. One possible explanation for this is that financial literacy might be more easily acquired via interactions with others. Maybe in urban areas or certain regions, there's just more exposure through work, community discussions, family networks to financial concepts and conversations.
That makes sense. What about family background? Does how your parents handle money affect your own literacy?
It appears to, significantly. Studies show a positive link between your financial literacy and your parents' level of education, especially your mother's education. It also correlates with whether your parents owned stocks or had retirement accounts when you were growing up. This strongly suggests that financial literacy may well get its start in the family, maybe through observing parents' saving habits, maybe through direct conversations about money, or maybe just absorbing the financial environment at home. Other factors show correlations too, things like nationality. People born outside the country often score lower. Even religion and political opinions show some differences. These all offer little clues about how financial knowledge is acquired and maybe who is most receptive to learning more.
Okay, so pulling all this fascinating detail together, financial literacy is definitely widespread, but it's not evenly distributed. It's clearly concentrated in specific subgroups.
Absolutely. If you had to paint a picture, it's particularly concentrated among the young and the old. Women, certain minority groups in the U.S. context, those with less formal education, and often residents of rural areas. We see these patterns repeating across many countries. And understanding this heterogeneity, this variation, is absolutely critical. Why? Because it strongly suggests that a one-size-fits-all approach to improving financial literacy, like a single national curriculum, is probably not going to be very effective. Interventions really need to be tailored to the specific needs and contexts of these different groups to have the best chance of success.
Okay, this brings us to the crucial question. So what? Why does all this actually matter? We know lots of people have low financial literacy, and we know who is most affected. But does it tangibly change how people behave? Does this lack of knowledge carry real measurable costs for individuals and maybe even the broader economy?
Oh, it matters profoundly. The research is quite clear that financial illiteracy leads to significant mistakes in economic decision-making. And these aren't just theoretical mistakes. They're mistakes that cost people real money, impact their savings, and affect their future security. Early research, like a well-known study looking at Swedish investors, found that households with lower financial literacy, often the poorer, less educated immigrant households, were demonstrably more likely to make financial errors in their investment choices. Another study confirmed that these kinds of mistakes were most common among the young and the old, exactly the groups with the lowest measured financial knowledge.
And are there consequences beyond just, say, suboptimal investment choices? What about more severe issues, like falling victim to scams, especially for those vulnerable older groups?
Yes, that's a growing and really tragic concern, particularly highlighted in the aftermath of the 2008-09 financial crisis. Financial scams are, as the paper states, often perpetrated against the elderly. Why? Because, as we discussed, older individuals may have lower actual financial savvy but higher confidence, and they often have accumulated assets over their lifetime, making them attractive targets. A survey by the FINRA Investor Education Foundation back in 2006 found that over half of older financial decision makers reported making at least one bad investment decision, and maybe even more alarmingly, 1 in 5 said they felt they'd been misled or defrauded but didn't report it. This is a huge, often hidden problem, and it's likely to grow as the baby boomer generation ages and faces potential cognitive decline alongside that misplaced confidence.
That's a really sobering statistic. Okay, what about the impact of financial literacy on more common, everyday financial behaviors, things like participating in the stock market or planning for retirement?
Financial literacy has a direct, measurable, and positive impact across a whole range of crucial behaviors. Take market participation and investment. The research consistently shows that the more financially literate you are, the significantly more likely you are to participate in financial markets and invest in assets like stocks. And interestingly, it seems to be advanced financial knowledge, understanding things like risk diversification and having the basic numeracy skills to do calculations that matter most for these investment decisions.
And retirement planning.
Same story. The financially savvy are simply more likely to undertake retirement planning. And perhaps unsurprisingly, those who actually plan for retirement also end up accumulating more wealth. This link between financial literacy, planning, and wealth accumulation is described as quite robust, meaning it's a strong, consistent finding across different countries and using various ways of measuring literacy and planning.
So it's not just about earning potential, it's very much about how effectively you manage your money and plan for the long term.
What about the other side of the balance sheet? The liability side, borrowing and debt. That's where so many people seem to struggle.
Absolutely. And this is where the costs of financial illiteracy often become painfully obvious. For example, studies show that less literate individuals tend to end up with more costly mortgages. They're also significantly less likely to refinance their home loans when interest rates fall, meaning they miss out on potentially huge savings over the life of the loan.
Just leaving money on the table.
Exactly. And look at credit card behavior. Studies found that people who couldn't correctly calculate compound interest actually borrowed more on their credit cards and accumulated less wealth overall. Other research confirmed that less financially savvy individuals incurred higher transaction costs, more fees, higher interest charges, and carried heavier debt loads. One study directly linked low financial literacy scores to costly credit card habits like paying late, going over the limit, and frequently using expensive cash advances. We saw the devastating impact of the subprime mortgage crisis. Was financial literacy a factor there too?
It seems it was, significantly. One fascinating study looked at mortgage defaults during that period. It showed that basic numerical ability was a very strong predictor of whether someone would default on their mortgage, especially subprime mortgages. Those homeowners with the highest numerical ability had roughly a 20 percentage point lower probability of defaulting compared to those with the lowest numerical ability.
20 percentage points is huge.
It's massive. It suggests that simply being able to understand the numbers involved made a huge difference. Furthermore, other research found that less financially literate individuals, particularly young adults aged 25-34, were substantially more likely to use high-cost methods of borrowing, things like payday loans, pawn shops, rent-to-own schemes. And the financial errors, the pecuniary mistakes, as the paper terms them, associated with this are tangible. Think about a typical $300 payday loan. If the borrower had access to and used a credit card instead, they could potentially save around $200 a year just in avoided fees and exorbitant interest. If they take out multiple loans, those costs skyrocket. It's real money just disappearing due to lack of knowledge, or maybe lack of better options driven by that lack of knowledge.
It certainly seems compelling that financial literacy acts almost like its own form of human capital, distinct from just having a college degree or being generally intelligent. Does the research really bear that out? Is it a unique skill set?
Yes. The evidence strongly points in that direction. While general education absolutely matters, people with college degrees are more likely to own stocks, less likely to use payday loans, etc. What's really striking is what happens when you statistically control for education. When researchers build models to predict financial behaviors and include both educational attainment and financial literacy scores, the effect of financial literacy doesn't disappear. In fact, its statistical significance often increases.
So both general education and specific financial knowledge matter independently.
Exactly. It suggests they both contribute uniquely to informed decision-making. This leads researchers to conclude that investment in financial knowledge really is a specific form of human capital. It's a specialized mental toolkit tailored for the financial world, not just a byproduct of having more years of schooling or a higher general IQ. It's its own valuable asset.
Okay, let's try and put some numbers on this. What are the actual tangible costs of this widespread financial ignorance, say, before people reach retirement? Can we quantify the impact?
Yes. Researchers have tried to estimate these costs, and they are substantial. They contribute significantly to economic inequality. For instance, one study in the Netherlands calculated that moving from the 25th percentile to the 75th percentile in financial literacy scores was associated with roughly €80,000 more in net worth. That's huge, about 3.5 times the median household income there. And in the U.S., sophisticated economic models simulating lifetimes of saving and investing suggest that differences in financial literacy alone could explain more than half the observed wealth inequality in the population. That's simply by enabling some people to earn higher returns and make smarter choices over time.
More than half of wealth inequality explained just by financial knowledge. That's staggering. What about the costs of specific mistakes, like paying high investment fees or avoiding the stock market?
Those add up quickly, too. Estimates suggest U.S. investors collectively forfeited something like $100 billion annually due to things like high investment fees, excessive trading costs that could largely be avoided by using simple, low-cost, passive index funds. And guess who bears the brunt of these costs? The least financially literate, who are often less aware of or less sensitive to these fees. Additionally, many financially illiterate individuals just avoid the stock market altogether, perhaps out of fear or misunderstanding complex products. Economists estimate this non-participation imposes significant lifetime welfare losses, potentially amounting to 4% of wealth. End quote. And the cost of not diversifying properly, also significant. A study in Sweden found the median investor there lost about 2.9% in annual returns on their risky portfolio due to under-diversification. That's about 0.5% of their disposable income lost each year. And for the worst diversified 10% of investors, the annual loss was much higher, around 4.5% of income. Real money vanishing year after year due to basic investment errors.
And these costs aren't just on the endowment side, right? They pile up on the debt side, too, like with those mortgages and credit cards you mentioned.
Absolutely. Take mortgages again. That suboptimal refinancing behavior we discussed. It was estimated to cost U.S. homeowners somewhere between $50 billion and $100 billion annually in the form of higher interest payments. And again, the least financially savvy were the least likely to refinance, meaning they disproportionately bore those costs. On credit cards, that study by Lusardi and Mitchell found something really telling. While less knowledgeable individuals made up about 29% of the cardholder population in their sample, they accounted for a whopping 42% of all the charges that incurred fees.
So they were generating fees at a much higher rate.
Much higher. Their average fees were 50% higher than the average cardholders. And importantly, the researchers estimated that about 1/3 of these extra charges were directly linked to low financial literacy, misunderstanding terms, mismanaging payments, etc. Again, tangible, measurable costs stemming directly from knowledge gaps.
So these costs don't just stop when people finish working. Financial ignorance continues to bite well into retirement. How does it impact people's financial security in their later years when maybe those decisions are even more critical?
Right. The impact of financial knowledge, or lack thereof, extends throughout the entire life cycle, including retirement. And given the sheer amount of wealth held by older households, over $18 trillion just for those over 65 in the U.S., the decisions made in retirement are incredibly important. As we establish, financial literacy is strongly linked to better retirement planning and greater wealth accumulation during working years. So it logically follows that the more financially savvy individuals are likely to be better financially endowed when they do retire. They simply arrive at retirement with a bigger nest egg. They're also typically better informed about complex things like pension system rules. They tend to pay lower investment fees within their retirement accounts, and they do a better job of diversifying their pension assets, all of which helps make their retirement funds more secure and last longer.
What about those really big, scary, maybe once-in-a-lifetime decisions retirees face? Things like deciding exactly when to claim Social Security, or whether to buy an annuity, or how to draw down assets safely. These feel like areas where one wrong move could have massive, potentially irreversible consequences.
You're absolutely right. These are incredibly complex decisions, often made only once, with huge long-term consequences. They require people to think about uncertain futures, forecasting how long they might live, what investment returns might be, future inflation, healthcare costs. It's daunting. Take the annuity puzzle, for instance. Economists have long noted that while annuities offer valuable protection against outliving your savings, relatively few people actually buy them. Research looking into this found that financially savvy individuals gave much more consistent responses when presented with different ways of framing annuity choices. They understood the underlying product. In contrast, the least financially literate gave inconsistent results and responded to irrelevant cues in the way the options were presented. This strongly suggests that financial literacy plays a key role in helping older households understand and potentially utilize important tools for managing longevity risk.
And you mentioned earlier that older adults often pay more for financial products.
Yes, studies have found that comparing across age groups, the elderly often pay much more than the middle-aged for various financial products, sometimes without even realizing it. One study cited found, for example, that 75-year-olds paid, on average, about $265 more per year for home equity lines of credit than 50-year-olds did. Now, the research is still fully unpacking the precise link between financial literacy and these specific price differences in old age. But it seems highly plausible that having greater baseline financial knowledge could empower older adults to better navigate these complex markets as they age, ask the right questions, and potentially avoid being overcharged or steered towards unnecessarily expensive products.
This brings us to a really critical point, one that researchers grapple with constantly. We've seen all these strong correlations. Higher financial literacy goes hand in hand with better saving, smarter investing, less costly debt. But is the financial literacy causing these better outcomes? Or is it just that people who are naturally smarter or more patient or maybe already wealthier also happen to score higher on financial literacy tests? It's that classic correlation versus causation problem.
Exactly. That's the core challenge. Untangling cause and effect and dealing with what economists call endogeneity and measurement error. Endogeneity is the issue you raised. Maybe wealth leads to literacy, not the other way around, or some third factor like patience drives both. And measurement error, as we discussed, means our tests aren't perfect gauges of knowledge. To get around these problems and really try to isolate a causal link to prove that financial literacy causes better outcomes, researchers have employed some truly clever methods. They use techniques like instrumental variables or IV estimation, which rely on finding ingenious instruments.
Ingenious instruments. Sounds intriguing. So the idea is to find something that influences people's financial knowledge, but isn't directly related to their underlying wealth or intelligence or patience, like a natural experiment.
Precisely. It's about finding some external factor, some shock or variation, that affects literacy but shouldn't affect financial behavior directly, except through its effect on literacy. For example, one study in Denmark used the opening of a new university in a local area as an instrument, looking at its impact on economics education and subsequent financial behavior. Another study in Russia used historical factors like the number of universities and newspapers in circulation in different regions. Here in the U.S., researchers have cleverly used the fact that different states mandated financial education in high school at different times. They combined this timing difference with data on state spending on education to create an instrument for financial literacy.
So using these external, almost random-seeming factors to isolate the impact of the knowledge itself.
Exactly. Other examples include using exposure to new educational voucher systems in Chile, looking at the financial experiences of siblings or parents in the Netherlands and Australia, using regional political attitudes in Germany, or even Japanese language ability in Japan as instruments. And here's the really crucial finding that comes out of all these sophisticated studies using different instruments across different countries. In all these cases, the IV financial literacy estimates always prove to be larger than the ordinary least squares estimates.
Okay, translate that for us. What does that mean in practice?
It means that the simple correlations we observe just looking at the association between literacy scores and financial behavior likely underestimate the true causal impact of financial literacy. When you use these more rigorous methods to isolate the causal effect, the estimated impact of financial knowledge on things like saving, investment, and debt management actually gets stronger. It suggests financial literacy is even more powerful than the simple correlations suggest.
Wow. So causation seems pretty well established. Are there other ways researchers try to prove this besides these complex statistical methods?
Yes, another powerful tool is field experiments. These are real-world studies where researchers actively intervene. They might randomly assign one group of people, the treatment group, to receive some form of financial education or information, and then compare their subsequent behavior to a similar control group that didn't receive the intervention.
Like a clinical trial, but for financial education.
It's exactly. For instance, a study in China randomly taught one group of farmers about compound interest. The result: that group showed a sizable increase in pension contributions compared to the control group. Direct evidence of the training causing the behavior change. Other experiments in Mexico and Chile randomly provided information about pension fund fees. The result: more financially literate individuals, or those who received the information, were significantly more likely to choose lower fee pension accounts. Even the financial crisis provided a sort of natural experiment. One study found that German households with lower baseline financial literacy were more likely to panic and sell their assets at a loss during the crisis downturn, locking in those losses. Meanwhile, a study in Russia found that the most financially literate individuals were significantly less likely to report that the crisis diminished their spending capacity. They had more savings available to cushion the blow. These experiments offer really compelling causal evidence. Financial knowledge genuinely influences financial behavior and resilience.
Okay, so given these widespread knowledge gaps, the significant costs of ignorance, and the strong evidence that literacy causes better behavior, the seemingly obvious solution is financial education, right? We need programs in schools, workplaces, communities. But the big question is, are these programs actually working? Are they making a measurable, lasting difference?
That is indeed the multi-billion-dollar question, isn't it? And the answer, like with most complex social issues, is, well, it's complicated. Financial education programs have definitely proliferated. You see them in schools, workplaces, libraries, targeted programs for specific groups like seniors or low-income families. However, evaluating their effectiveness faces some real challenges, starting with the theory itself. Remember how we framed financial literacy as an investment in human capital? If people are choosing whether or not to invest in this knowledge based on their own circumstances,
then you wouldn't expect everyone to react the same way to an education program.
Exactly. The theory suggests it is unlikely, both theoretically and practically, to change everyone's behavior in the same way. For someone already saving adequately, maybe the program reinforces good habits. For someone deep in high-interest debt, the optimal outcome might be learning to prioritize debt reduction, not necessarily saving more in a 401k immediately. So judging a program solely on whether it boosts average savings rates might miss the mark. It needs a more nuanced evaluation.
That makes sense. What about the intensity of these programs? Is just attending a one-hour seminar enough, or does it take more sustained effort to really move the needle?
That's another critical point the research highlights. Given how little many people know about even basic concepts like compound interest or inflation, it seems unlikely that short exposure to financial literacy training would make much of a dent. Studies looking at things like brief retirement seminars or one-off employee benefits fairs generally find them to be fairly ineffective at changing long-term behavior. It likely takes more significant, repeated exposure to really internalize the concepts and change habits. Furthermore, surprisingly few studies have actually done a rigorous cost-benefit analysis. How much does the program cost versus the value of the behavior change it produces? This kind of analysis is crucial for figuring out which programs are truly efficient and scalable, and it's noted as a high priority for future research.
And we need to consider that heterogeneity again, right? The fact that literacy varies so much across different groups.
Absolutely. That variation strongly suggests that programs targeting specific groups are likely to be more effective than one-size-fits-all approaches. What works for young adults might not work for pre-retirees. What resonates with high-income earners might not be relevant for low-income families. Tailoring is likely key. And the golden rule for really knowing if a program works, it's the experimental approach we just discussed, randomly assigning people to treatment and control groups. Unfortunately, the paper notes that relatively few financial education programs historically have been designed or evaluated using these rigorous standards. That makes it really hard to draw firm, broad conclusions about what works best overall.
Let's zoom in on high school financial education. It seems like such a logical place to start building that foundation early, but I know there's been some debate about whether those school programs actually work.
Yes. There certainly has been debate. Some early influential studies, particularly associated with the Jumpstart Coalition and researcher Louis Mandel, looked at states that mandated financial education courses. Their initial findings were quite discouraging. They suggested that students in states with mandates didn't score any better on financial literacy tests than students in states without mandates, and sometimes they even scored worse.
Worse? How could that happen?
Well, it led some critics to argue that maybe financial education in schools was ineffective, perhaps poorly taught, or even a waste of valuable curriculum time that could be spent on math or reading. However, subsequent researchers took a closer look. People like Wallstad, Rebeck, McDonald, and Tennyson and Gwynn reanalyzed the data and methodology. They pointed out several crucial factors that the earlier studies might have missed: the specific content of the courses, the quality of the tests used to measure knowledge, the preparation and training of the teachers, and critically, the sheer amount of instruction time. Their conclusion was more nuanced. Simply mandating a course isn't enough. But mandating a course that requires significant exposure to personal finance topics, meaning a substantial, well-designed class, not just a few lessons tucked into another subject, can be effective in boosting knowledge.
So quality and depth matter immensely. It's not just checking a box saying financial education offered. And teacher preparedness sounds critical too.
Absolutely critical, and often a major weakness. A national study found that while nearly all K-12 teachers agreed financial education was important, quote, fewer than 1/5 stated that they were prepared to teach any of the 6 personal finance concepts commonly included in curricula. They felt particularly unprepared to teach complex topics like risk management and insurance, as well as saving and investing, precisely the areas where adults struggle most. And unfortunately, many state mandates for financial education don't include specific requirements or funding for teacher training. That obviously undermines the whole effort. When more rigorous studies do carefully align the tests with what's actually taught and measure knowledge gains properly, they have shown significant positive impacts from well-implemented high school financial education.
Okay, what about moving beyond schools to the workplace? That seems like another prime opportunity, reaching adults who are actively making financial decisions, especially about retirement savings, through things like 401k.
Yes, the workplace is a key setting. But evaluation there faces its own hurdles. A major one is self-selection bias. Think about who typically shows up for a voluntary lunchtime seminar on retirement planning.
Probably the people who are already interested or worried about it.
Exactly. Employees who attend these seminars might already be more motivated to save, more financially engaged to begin with. So if their savings rate goes up afterward, it's hard to definitively say the seminar caused it. Maybe they would have increased their savings anyway. It's difficult to isolate the program's true effect. Also, researchers often have very little information about the actual content or the quality of these workplace seminars. Are they effective? Are they just sales pitches in disguise? It's often unclear.
So how are researchers trying to overcome these challenges? Are there examples of workplace interventions that do seem to show a genuine impact, maybe using those experimental designs?
Yes, some promising interventions use more rigorous approaches. For example, one study exposed a representative sample of U.S. adults to short, engaging videos explaining core concepts: compound interest, inflation, risk. Compared to a control group who didn't see the videos, the treated group, those who watched, ended up being more knowledgeable and better able to answer hypothetical questions about saving decisions. This suggests that clear, targeted educational content, even if brief, can shift knowledge and potentially influence choices.
So delivery method and clarity matter.
Definitely. Another really interesting experiment randomly assigned university employees to receive customized information. This information specifically showed them the direct link between their current savings rate and their potential income after retirement, a calculation that's really hard for most people to do on their own. The group that got this personalized, actionable information, they increased their pension contributions by an additional 0.17% of salary compared to the control group. And importantly, they also reported feeling better informed about their retirement planning. This kind of rigorous study shows that even relatively low-cost informational nudges, when well-designed and personalized, can effectively boost savings and confidence.
It sounds like those rigorous experimental methods are really the key to figuring out what truly works. And it's encouraging that we're seeing similar positive results coming out of research in developing countries too. How are those studies adding to our understanding?
Yes, the research in developing countries is really valuable. It often focuses on populations with extremely low baseline levels of financial literacy, making the potential impact of interventions perhaps even clearer. And the experimental method, randomized controlled trials, is increasingly becoming the standard approach there. These studies provide great insights. For instance, a study in India used a video-based financial education program for low-income households. They found that while the program didn't immediately boost numeracy scores, perhaps because basic education levels were very low to begin with, it did significantly improve participants' awareness of financial products and shifted their attitudes towards planning and saving in a positive way.
So even if complex calculations didn't stick right away, changing awareness and attitudes is still a really important first step, right? It opens the door.
Absolutely, it's a crucial foundation. Other examples. Research in India found that villages with higher financial literacy had greater demand for rainfall insurance, showing that understanding helps people value useful financial tools. Another study in China showed that specific financial training for farmers significantly improved their take-up rates for weather insurance, helping them manage risk. And maybe most relevant to our earlier discussion, another study in China demonstrated that simply teaching farmers about the power of compound interest produced a sizable increase in pension contributions. That's really encouraging, given how poorly understood that concept is globally. So pulling it all together on program effectiveness. A lot of effort and money has gone into financial education, but the paper concludes that relatively few studies have been informed by either a suitable theoretical model or a carefully designed empirical approach. We shouldn't expect every program to magically transform everyone's behavior overnight, especially given the theory of financial knowledge as an investment. And short, generic, untailored programs seem largely ineffective. The path forward really lies in emulating these rigorous field experiments to understand precisely how targeted information and training can change both knowledge and ultimately behavior.
Okay, let's try to summarize the key findings from this deep dive. First, low financial knowledge is undeniably widespread across ages, genders, countries. It's a global issue.
Sure.
Second, despite this, there are clearly important benefits of greater financial knowledge. It leads to, well, better decisions across the board, savvier saving and investing, more effective debt management, increased retirement planning, higher stock market participation, and ultimately greater wealth accumulation.
Definitely. The positive impacts are well documented.
And third, crucially, thanks to all that rigorous research using instrumental variables and field experiments, we can be pretty confident that the causality flows from knowledge to behavior. It's not just correlation. Financial literacy genuinely causes better outcomes.
That's a critical conclusion, yes. The evidence for causality is quite strong now.
But despite knowing all this, there are still big questions and work to be done, right? What are the top priorities for researchers and policymakers moving forward?
Absolutely. Much work remains. One huge missing piece we touched on is rigorous cost-benefit analysis. We need to know which sorts of financial education programs are most appropriate and least expensive for which kinds of people. Getting a handle on the efficiency and return on investment for different approaches is a major priority to guide policy effectively.
Makes total sense. You need to know where to put the resources for the biggest impact. Now, this leads to a broader strategic question. Is the best path forward primarily about educating everyone to become financially sophisticated? Or is it more about designing financial systems and choices, what's often called choice architecture, that make it easier for people to make good decisions, even if they aren't experts?
That's a great question, and the answer is likely not either. These approaches can be, and probably should be, highly complementary. Choice architecture offers some incredibly powerful tools for influencing behavior without necessarily requiring deep understanding. The classic example is automatic enrollment in employer pension plans. Instead of making employees actively sign up, opt in, employers automatically enroll them unless they actively choose to opt out. This simple switch in the default has been shown to dramatically increase pension participation, often from rates below 40% to nearly 90%. And it often leads to people ending up in better diversified portfolios too, like target date funds. That's a massive behavioral shift achieved just by changing the default setting.
And we've seen a big push for consumer protection regulations, especially since the financial crisis. Is that part of this choice architecture idea too, trying to simplify things or protect people from complexity?
Yes, very much so. Think about regulations aimed at standardizing disclosures for mortgages or credit cards, using plain language, making fees transparent. The idea is to reduce the search costs for consumers, making it easier to compare products and understand the terms. This is part of creating a choice environment where people are less likely to be tripped up by complexity or fine print, especially for those big, infrequent decisions like buying a home or choosing retirement investments, where you don't get many chances to learn from mistakes.
But even these defaults and simplified structures aren't perfect, right? You mentioned potential downsides.
Right. Defaults, while powerful, can be problematic if not designed carefully. For instance, if the automatic enrollment savings rate is set very low, say, only 3% of salary employees might not contribute enough to get the full employer match, leaving free money on the table. Worse, some research suggests people might interpret that low default rate as a kind of suggested target even if they were previously saving more. They might actually reduce their contributions to match the default. This default stickiness, where people just passively accept the default even if it's not optimal for them, seems to disproportionately affect lower income, less educated individuals, precisely those who are often the least financially literate. They get stuck in a potentially suboptimal choice.
So even well-intentioned defaults can backfire, especially given that huge variety, that heterogeneity in people's financial situations and literacy levels. A single default probably won't work well for everyone.
Exactly. The human capital view of financial literacy really emphasizes this heterogeneity. People have different goals, different debt levels, different risk tolerances, different access to financial products. No single default savings rate or investment allocation is going to be optimal for everybody. For example, someone drowning in high-interest credit card debt. For them, the rational first step might be to aggressively pay that down, not necessarily maximize their 401k contribution, especially if there's no employer match. And we have to remember, roughly half the U.S. workforce doesn't even have access to an employer-sponsored pension plan, so defaults in those plans don't help them at all.
So if defaults aren't a silver bullet and becoming a financial expert is unrealistic for many, what are some other, maybe simpler ways to help people save and make better decisions, especially if they feel overwhelmed by the complexity?
Simplification is definitely a key strategy. Some programs have had success with things like quick enrollment for workplace savings plans. This essentially gives employees an easy option to just check a box, opting into a preset contribution rate and a default investment allocation, like a target date fund. It removes the burden of making multiple complex decisions right at the start. Another approach involves providing clear, simple planning aids, especially to new hires. These might break down the enrollment process into small, easy steps, clearly state the minimum contribution needed to get the employer match, and explicitly indicate the default investment option. The research notes that starting a new job is often a good time to think about saving, as people are already undergoing significant life changes and might be more receptive to establishing new financial habits. We also see promising examples of simplification from developing countries. One program used simplified rule of thumb training to help micro-entrepreneurs in the Dominican Republic improve their business practices. Another study in Chile found that using self-help peer groups and simple text message reminders help boost employee savings. These examples show that removing cognitive load and providing simple, actionable guidance can make a real difference.
Okay, but given all this complexity, maybe the answer for many people is just outsourcing it. If it's too hard to figure out on your own, shouldn't you just hire a professional financial advisor? Is that the ultimate solution for navigating these tricky waters?
That's certainly an option. And the idea that not everyone needs to be or even should be a financial expert makes sense. Many routine financial decisions probably don't require professional advice. But for those really complex, high-stakes decisions, planning for retirement, managing large investment portfolios, dealing with inheritances, a good advisor could be incredibly valuable. The challenge, however, lies in the reality of who actually uses advisors and the quality of advice they receive. Research shows that relatively few households actually consult professional financial advisors. Most people still rely heavily on informal sources, family, friends, coworkers, for financial guidance. And even among those who do seek professional advice, studies find many are only willing to act on recommendations that align with their own pre-existing ideas or biases. They might ignore advice that challenges their views.
So people might not seek advice, or they might not follow it if they get it. And then there's the question of whether the advice itself is any good, right?
Precisely. The quality of financial advice can be highly variable, and it's often very difficult for the average consumer to judge the expertise or objectivity of an advisor. Compensation structures can also create conflicts of interest. Is the advisor recommending what's best for you, or what earns them the highest commission? Some researchers argue that financial literacy and financial advice might actually be complements rather than substitutes, meaning having a higher level of financial literacy might make you better at identifying knowledgeable, trustworthy advisors and better able to critically evaluate and implement their recommendations. There is evidence that financial counseling can be effective, particularly in helping people reduce debt and improve repayment behavior. But the reality remains that most financial decisions are still guided by informal networks, not professionals. highlighting the ongoing need to boost baseline knowledge. The bigger picture, especially after the global financial crisis, there's a really strong consensus among policymakers worldwide that something needs to be done about these financial knowledge gaps. The research we've discussed today has come a long way. It's confirmed the causal impact of financial literacy, distinguished it from general intelligence, and started to pinpoint what kinds of interventions show promise.
So what are the key tasks still ahead for researchers working in this vital area? Where does the research need to go next?
There are several high-priority tasks. First, researchers need to continue refining those theoretical models of saving and decision-making to incorporate financial knowledge even more realistically as a form of human capital that people invest in and that depreciates over time. Second, we desperately need better ways to measure financial education efforts in the real world. We need detailed data not just on whether a state mandates a course, but on the actual curriculum content, the hours of instruction, the training teachers receive, the quality of the materials. Without better measurement of the input, it's hard to evaluate the output. Third, research should expand to look at the impact of financial literacy on new outcomes beyond saving and investment. What about student loan decisions? Health investments and insurance choices, decisions around reverse mortgages, how people claim Social Security benefits. These are all huge areas with massive economic consequences where financial literacy likely plays a critical role. And finally, perhaps most importantly, we just need more rigorous experimental research, more randomized controlled trials to definitively confirm causality across different contexts, and crucially, to identify the most cost-effective interventions. We need to know what works best for whom and at what cost, so that limited resources can be deployed effectively. Because ultimately, while implementing programs to raise financial literacy certainly has costs, it takes time, money, effort, the evidence strongly suggests that the costs of being liquidity constrained, over-indebted, and poor due to financial ignorance are likely far, far greater for individuals and for society as a whole. It's an investment that almost certainly pays off.
So here's a final thought to leave you with. If financial literacy truly is a form of human capital, like a skill you can actively build, an investment in yourself that yields significant returns throughout your life, how might thinking about it that way change your own approach? How might it change how you think about learning about money, not just for your own benefit, but maybe for helping those around you, your kids, your family, your community? Perhaps your own next deep dive doesn't need to be overwhelming. Maybe it just starts with getting a slightly better handle on one of those core concepts we talked about today: compound interest, inflation, or risk diversification.